Welcome, everyone. This is session 4 in the Prairie Edition of MarshWatch. We're just going to be covering birds and frogs today. We're not going to try to cram anything else in, so it should be a fairly relaxed session, which I'm always excited for. Before I get started, I'd just like to say that I'm located in Saskatoon and broadcasting from Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. And it's just a pretty beautiful city, I think. My name is Leanne Latchmore. I'm going to keep introducing myself because there seems to be a trickle of, new participants every time. So my name's Leanne Latchmore. Don't worry about the last name. It's long, it's French. A lot of the letters are silent. But I have the immense pleasure of working for Birds Canada, which is a national not-for-profit with a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada, as well as their habitats. And as you can see through these photographs, over the years, I have found myself in a lot of wetlands. They're near and dear to my heart. I think, especially in the field of biology, whatever you got started doing, whatever was your first job, you always hold a really special place for either that ecosystem or those species. And for me, that was in 2008 in Southern Ontario. I was doing least bittern surveys for a master's student working through Birds Canada. So I've had a major love of wetlands ever since, and I find them absolutely fascinating. There's all kinds of really interesting birds and other life that, exist in there, and I really love doing it. I used to do a lot of walking through a lot of wetlands, which doesn't sound like everybody's cup of tea, and it totally isn't, but I absolutely love it. And so I'm super fortunate that part of my job involves teaching people about the places that I love so much. So without further ado, let's get started. We're going to talk about birds and amphibian ID, and that's going to be recorded and posted online afterwards. And then after that, we'll turn off the recording, and then we'll get to the quiz, and we'll have just a general discussion afterwards. Today, I'm kind of excited about this suite of species because we have a few that we're starting to get into a couple of the trickier ones. So we've got blue-winged teal and green-winged teal, and the drakes, they look fairly different, but the hens, my goodness, they look really similar to one another, and I'm hopeful that I can get you, identifying the hens for each of these species. Maybe, maybe not this go around if it's your first time, but, hopefully send you in the right direction with some tips and tricks. Two similar looking grebes, the horned grebe and the irid grebe, the Wilson snipe, which is just a character in and of itself, the black tern, which is just an absolutely gorgeous tern, and two small little amphibians that are mostly going to be in Manitoba on the Great Plains, but as we'll learn, the spring peeper is making its way into Saskatchewan, so that's also pretty exciting. Okay. Without further ado, let's get into the birds. So first up, we have the aptly named blue-winged teal. This is a small dabbling duck, and again, small, medium, large, that kind of has more weight to it when you see these birds out on the water with other species around them. Size can be really difficult to judge unless you have something of known size near a bird. So just saying small kind of gives you that impression that if you were to see that in a group of species, it's going to be smaller than the majority of the other ducks that you're going to see around them. So again, that's why I just kind of say small, medium, and large ducks, because you're not going to go out there with a ruler unless you're hunting them or banding them. You're not going to get the chance to measure these ducks. So small duck, they have a dark bill, and the thing that really stands out, as always, is the white on these birds. And again, if you're new to this, white is really, really key to understanding how to identify ducks at a distance. White reflects back all of that bright white light. So I'm not sharing my slides yet. Oh my gosh. The drakes have this really incredible large crescent shape patch of white right on their face. Their head is this kind of really deep, almost like a purpley blue. It looks almost black in the majority of lighting situations. So, you have a situation like this where obviously the lighting's really nice and perfect, but for the most part, that face is just going to look fairly dark. And the thing that stands out on it is that really, really large crescent shape between the eye and the bill. It is a dabbling duck, so you're not going to see it diving underwater. So they're going to feed at the water surface or do a little bit of a tip up. And on the rear end, they've got a nice dark rump with a white little patch at the rear right here. Along the sides, they have these really cute little spots, and they are just a super handsome little duck. That brown kind of speckly body. it kind of blends all together into this kind of brownish coloration. But for the most part, it is looking, like like a duck. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm still laughing internally about all those slides that we're missing. Okay. The speculum is really helpful in this species. So much like we saw on the northern shoveler, which is related to the teal, the blue-winged teal also has a lovely blue patch on its wing. The speculum is this dark iridescent green in the drakes, and in the hens, it's mostly just dark. You might get a little bit of green every now and then, but for the most part, it's just kind of dark. But both sexes will show that powdery blue patch. The drake's going to have a much bigger white patch as well on the bottom of that blue patch. The hens are a bit of a challenge. So they're going to be small. They also do have that nice dark bill, but overall, much like the rest of the dabbling ducks, they're mottled, they're brown, they are, looking to be camouflaged as they're nesting in the upland. The thing to focus in here is the face. So overall, there's this kind of palish portion to the bottom of the base, and there's these whitish eye arcs. It doesn't make a full ring around the eye, and sometimes it can be a little subtle, but it does kind of highlight the eye, and it makes it look a little bit bigger than it would if these featherings were dark. So small mottled dabbling duck, dark bill, and then you look at the face and see, okay, yeah, it is a little bit paler to it. It's not kind of uniformly dark or anything. And this will come in handy when we talk about the green-winged teals in a sec here. So whitish at the base of the bill, white little eye arcs, otherwise small and mottled brown. Talked about the wing patch. They do show a wing patch. So if you do have them swimming around, and depending on how they're holding their feathers or how they're holding their wings, you will see a little bit of a pale patch on the wing. So sometimes you can see that while they're floating around. Oftentimes, though, they don't. In the eclipse plumage, which if you want to know about eclipse plumage, we talked about that in another webinar. This is when the males go through a molt and they tend to look like the females because they want to be secretive because they are replacing their flight feathers. Here's a lovely contrast photo of a hen and an eclipse drake. He's still retaining that kind of greenish speculum and that big white border patch on the wing. And the hen, she still has her just blue patch. So you can still tell them apart even though they look really similar in this plumage. Okay. They are an opportunistic dabbler. They feed at the water surface, so they're going to be eating everything from aquatic invertebrates, aquatic vegetation. You can see them snacking here on some duckweed. They'll eat algae, and they'll go after agricultural grains, especially in the fall or on the wintering grounds. They make a soft kind of pip-pip noise. It's not terribly loud, and I don't find that I identify blue-winged teal by sound very often, but they do make a lovely little pip-pip call. So as you can imagine, that's not terribly loud. It doesn't travel very far. So if you hear it, that's always nice, but it's not usually going to be the thing that's going to help you identify this duck. But again, the drake at a distance, that really big crescent moon kind of looking white patch on its face. And again, a black and white rear with a nice big white patch kind of at the end of the flank, kind of leading into the rump area. Blue-winged teals are found across a fair bit of Canada and the United States, wide distribution, so you're pretty likely to see blue-winged teals wherever you go in North America. Okay. The similar green-winged teal, the drake doesn't look very similar at all, thank goodness. It makes it easy that way. This is our smallest dabbling duck. So if you see a blue-winged teal and a green-winged teal, the green-winged teal is going to look even smaller than the blue-winged teal, but both overall, they're going to look like fairly small ducks if you have them in a mixed flock. They tend to have a bit of a smaller head. They're a little bit more compact overall. And the drakes are really gorgeous. They've got this chestnut head with a dark green eye stripe that goes all the way down the back of the head. And again, this kind of green is iridescent, so if the lighting isn't right, that's just going to look dark. It's going to look black at a distance, but that chestnut head, it's still going to contrast with that dark stripe going down the eye. The thing that really stands out and is what I use to identify these, like 99% of the time, if I'm just scanning waterfowl, is this white spur right along this gray flank right here. There's no other dabbling duck or diving duck that's going to have that similar white spur on an overall kind of grayish flank and grayish back. So that white spur stands out like a sore thumb at a distance. Their rump, they actually have a little bit of a pale kind of whitish or straw buffy colored patch at the tail here, bordered in black. And that's actually more useful for the hens because they retain a little bit of that white patch there. But again, the thing that really stands out the most on these is that little white spur. And oftentimes you'll see it reflected in the reflection on the water. So it's kind of a neat little patch on the bird. And it's in a unique spot for the most part. The speculums on these guys are both in the hen and the drake. We're going to have kind of a two-tone thing going, so closer to the body, they're going to be this iridescent green, and then they kind of fade to a bit more blackish almost. There's going to be a border that can either be white or buffy straw colored above and below. And this isn't one that you always see a ton of, as they're sitting. I find for whatever reason you see a bit more of the blue wing on the blue wing teal. And that's because of where that blue patch is. It just shows a little bit more as they're sitting on the water. Now the hens, they are going to be very similar to the blue-winged teal, but they differ in two important ways. The first is this little white patch by the rump here. And I don't know why, but it took me years and an embarrassing amount of years struggling to identify teal hens. They were really tough. They were brown, they were small, and for whatever reason, I didn't pick up on this little white wedge here on the back of their body until, it wasn't even that many years ago. It was probably 5 years ago that I finally clued in on it. So it's not always visible, especially if the birds are standing and they're not just floating around on the water. But if they're sitting on the water, usually you can see this kind of white patch or kind of a straw buffy colored patch on their rump area. Otherwise, the face looks really dark. It doesn't have that kind of palish coloration at the base of the bill or around the eyes. It's just more dark overall. Both of them do have a bit of a stripe that goes through the eye, but overall, the green-winged teal hen just looks a bit darker. And again, a slightly different body shape to them. They're smaller, they're more compact. They tend to have a steeper forehead overall, but really it's that cream patch on the rear and that dark head overall. And if they're, holding their feathers in the way that you can see the green patch, that nice lovely green patch is also going to give it away. They're another opportunistic dabbler. They like sedges, grasses, aquatic vegetation, insects and their larvae, crustaceans, and mollusks. So here we can see a different angle on this green-winged teal hen, and we can see that little patch on her rear end. Otherwise, brown mottled with an overall darkish looking face. The drake, again, here with his little white spur, really helpful for identifying at a distance. But you can see, even in this kind of light, it looks almost like this is kind of some sunset light. This patch on the rump here, because it's not a pure white, it doesn't always stand out quite as much as the pure white does. This is another bird that calls. The peeping I find is slightly louder than the blue-winged teal. I hear the green-winged teal more often than I do blue-wing, so they make kind of a peeping noise. And depending on how they're holding their feathers, you can see a little bit of a crest going on. Oftentimes, you don't see that. They do have quite a wide distribution across North America, and they're another one of those species that is found across the northern regions of the globe. So you can go, if you're out birding in Siberia for whatever reason, the MarshWatch birds are still going to be relevant to some of what you're seeing. I always find that amazing, just how widely distributed some of these species are. Okay, let's compare the teal hens side by side because that's the really tricky bit here. So both of them are small ducks with dark bills. That's kind of where you're going to start. You're seeing a group of waterfowl and you're like, ooh, they're small and they're brownish. That's your first bucket. You're like, okay, well, Mottled brown, you're putting them into the dabblers, and then you're like small, dark bill, you're putting them into the teal hens. And if that's as far as you get for a while, you are still doing great. Don't, you know, feel like you have to identify every single bird you see because not every bird that you lay eyes on is going to be identifiable. Maybe it's just a little bit too far for your binoculars or your spotting scope, and you just can't, but you can be pretty certain that it's one of the teal. They're kind of smallish, they're kind of darkish. So comparing these two side by side, an overall lighter face for the blue-winged teal. You can see that pale base of the bill and those whitish eye arcs. The green-winged teal hen overall just has a darker face. You know, that eye isn't highlighted. There's no white patch at the base of the bill. She tends to have a finer bill compared to blue-winged teal, and this goes for both sexes. Blue-winged teal has a slightly more, spatulate bill than the green-winged teal, but that's, again, that's really subtle. That's if you're, you know, really into looking at nesting waterfowl and you're picking apart the two species. For the green-winged teal hen, that white patch at the area kind of in the rump, sometimes it's a little bit bigger. It's quite big on this individual here, but can be nice bright white, or it can be a little bit creamish. So that white patch at the rear, you know it's going to be a green-winged teal hen. But again, overall, that darker face. Both of them have a bit of a dark eye line. Sometimes it shows up better on the blue-winged teal, depending on the lighting in the individual. But again, pale overall on the face, dark overall on the face, and that white patch on the rear end, or the cream patch. Again, totally missing from the blue-winged teal hen. She's just spotted, brown, mottled overall. Okay, sometimes it's helpful to see even more of them side by side and just to get a feel for how they look. So I'm just going to give you a second here. I'll take a sip of water and just take a peek and see what you think about each of the birds. You can sort of see there's differences between the two. Hopefully that's starting to be a little bit easier. So for this first one here, we got a white patch on the rear end, and overall that kind of darkish face. We got ourselves a green-winged teal hen. This one over here, paler around the face. Now, it's a combination. I think this individual doesn't have as bright white, and it might also be a fair bit about the lighting. So that paler area looks a bit more buffy, but you can still see there's still distinct eye arcs around the eye. It makes the eye look a fair bit bigger. And again, there's a clean, paler patch at the base of that bill. So we've got blue-winged teal. And if you got your eagle eyes on, you can even see just a little bit of blue poking out right on the back here. This one down over here shows it a bit more clearly. We got that white patch at the base of the bill, whitish eye arcs, another blue-winged teal hen. This middle one, if you guessed it correctly, we can see that nice dark head, and it's hard to see because she's not sitting on the water, but you can see just a little bit of that white patch on the rump area. So we got another green-winged teal. And last but not least, we've got another blue-winged teal because we got that pale base of the bill and those whitish eye arcs. So hopefully some of that helps to, demystify the teal hens a little bit. And again, I just want to reiterate, telling the teal hens apart is, higher level birding. If you're just, getting into your waterfowl and you're just like, I want to get the drakes down, I'm just going to get the colorful ones out of the way, then absolutely go ahead and do that. And not every bird that you lay eyes on is identifiable. So just keep that in mind. If you're finding them difficult, it's because they are. It's not just you. Okay. Moving along, we've got a couple of grebes, and as we mentioned, I think last time or the time before, grebes are birds that are, they're not ducks. They're more closely related to the loons. They are expert divers. They have their feet placed really far back on their body, so they're actually pretty much incapable of walking around on land. They can get up onto their nests fairly awkwardly, but they're really expert divers, so they need a runway to get flying, and they can't really walk around on land. The horned grebe is a smallish grebe. They have a nice, short, pointed little bill, and overall, their head is kind of flat-topped and blocky. The thing that stands out, it's not white, but it is the palest part of the bird that you're likely to see, is this kind of eyebrow stripe. Now, Both sexes are similar. Males tend to be a little bit larger and a little bit brighter. I have found that I find that really hard to tell, even if I see, a pair side by side. So, for all intents and purposes, both sexes look fairly similar to one another. This eyebrow stripe can be kind of yellow or golden in color. They have a blocky black head, and their upper back is also dark. And then they have rufous on their flanks and on their necks. They have a bright white belly, which, again, like white always does, it stands out really far at a distance. So when they're grooming, sometimes they'll roll a bit onto their side and expose their belly. It's just a shock of white. At a distance, especially in poor light conditions, this lovely rufusy red and this kind of blackish color, it all blends up and it looks the same. The thing that you're really going to see at a distance is that kind of overall blocky head shape and that big kind of yellow golden eyebrow. Their eyes are really trippy. They're like blood red with a little bit of yellow right around the pupil. They just are, they have one of the freakiest looking eyeballs I've ever seen. Um, you'll find horned grebes in small ponds in pairs. They don't like to be on a larger body of water, and it doesn't seem like they can hold their own against some of the larger grebe species. So you'll often see them on small, a bit more isolated ponds, usually in pairs, and some of these ponds can be quite tiny. They're, again, an expert diver, as all grebes are, so they're going after aquatic insects and their larvae, and especially in the winter, on their wintering grounds, fish and crustaceans. As other grebes do, they have some elaborate courtship rituals, and here's some examples of the penguin dance, which is just one of the best names, and the weed ceremony. They do this thing where they'll both go under the water and they'll pick up aquatic vegetation because that's what they build their nests out of, and they'll use it in this elaborate courtship display, basically proving to the other one that, see, like, look, I am able to, get all of this wonderful nesting material and build you the best nest. Like, I am just the best mate. It's really adorable if you ever get the chance to see them. Early breeding season, so kind of like May, early June is when you're more likely to see these behaviors. So really, really cute. And they have kind of a raspy, whinny braying call, but they're a very silent grebe compared to the others. You'll hear you'll hear them vocalize in the really early spring and sometimes in the late summer, but for much of the breeding season, they're effectively silent. I don't know that I've ever actually heard and detected one just by hearing them on a bird survey in the breeding season, which is 28 May to 7 July. So again, this is one that we're really going to focus on the visuals for, but of course I will play you their call because it's still pretty cool. So they make a variety of kind of raspy, whinnying, and braying noises. And again, this is not something that you hear very often at all, but do compare it to the redneck grebe, which is very vocal and does call a fair bit throughout the entire season, which has a more robust kind of whinny braying and is quite loud, and you'll hear it a fair bit. So really much, much louder, and again, likely to hear it during the summertime. Horned grebes have a wide distribution. You don't see them so much in eastern Canada. We're lucky to get them here in the prairie provinces, across the prairie provinces. I've actually seen them in far northern Saskatchewan all the way up here, and I was surprised at that. There was the only grebe I saw there, and on several ponds there was pairs of these birds, so you can see them in a wide variety of habitats. And again, another one that if you're likely to go birding in Siberia, you will be well equipped to do that. So they do have a wide global range. Okay, the similar grebe is the eared grebe. This is another small bird. It has an even kind of shorter, pointier bill, but overall, its head looks triangular in shape. And that's the thing for this one that stands out. They do have these wispy plumes behind the eye, but they're not. I feel like if they were fuller, like if there was more feathering there, that you would be able to see them better at a distance. But as it is, they're kind of wispy and the light just doesn't reflect very well off of them. And sometimes they can even get, a little bit clumpy with, the bird going underwater. But what you will see at a distance is this small kind of compact, dainty looking bird with a very triangular, pointy looking head. Kind of like squint your eyes at the ones on the bottom of the screen here. That overall kind of pointy cone head look to them is really the giveaway for them. Again, both sexes look the same. They're overall black in coloration. They do have some of that same kind of rusty reddish tones on their flanks. And I don't know what it is about the grebes with this black and rusty red combination, but for whatever reason, you see it on a fair bit of the birds. This is something that you'll see in good light, but at a distance, again, they're just going to look like a dark, small bird. They too have a white belly, so sometimes you will see that if they're doing any of their ceremonial displays or if they're, preening their belly feathers. They inhabit different habitats than pardon me, than the horned grebes do. So these guys like really shallow wetlands for the most part. You can see them on bigger bodies of water, but they'll usually have an extensive kind of shallow wetland area associated with it. They nest in large colonies. So the horned grebes that we saw, you'll almost always only ever see them in pairs. They don't hang out with other grebes. They're always kind of off in their own isolated pond. Eared grebes, you can see, 50, 60 birds at a time in a colony. There can be colonies in the hundreds. So you don't usually just see one or two eared grebes, and that can also be a clue. If you're seeing a whole bunch of them, these little pointy cone heads, chances are good based on that shape and that behavior that you're seeing an eared grebe. Again, because they're a grebe, they're an expert diver, so they're going after all kinds of things underwater: aquatic insects, larvae, small crustaceans, especially brine shrimp, small fish, and mollusks. And they're colonial, and they also tolerate other species in their colony. So this was a colony that I had the chance to visit that had Franklin's gulls. These are these bigger nests around the edges here, and there was eared grebe nests scattered all throughout them. Really neat to see, there's a lot of species that don't like to nest amongst others, and then there's some that are very colonial. So the eared grebe, again, very colonial. You're likely to see multiples of them if you do lay your eyes on them. And some of those wetlands, they can be really shallow. You can see that, a lot of this is just flooded field here, so it's not very deep. They're going to be going after a lot of insects in this type of habitat. And you can see that nice white little belly as these guys are doing a bit of a display. You hear them a little bit more than you do the horned grebe, and they kind of sound like poo-wee-chick, poo-wee-chick. So neat little call. This is something that you're likely to spot visually because they're going to be in these shallow kind of wetland areas. And again, that kind of pointed cone head look to them. Eared grebes also have a large distribution globally, but in North America, they're kind of restricted to the West. We're very lucky, again, in the prairie provinces to be seeing a fair number of these nesting here. Here's their global distribution, which is still quite large. Like, what is going on in in Southern Africa? They're just hanging out year round there. I always think that this is fascinating where these birds end up. Okay, comparing the two side by side, this is a really fabulous photo that someone in the States took, and he's very graciously let me use this photo, and it shows the two side by side, and you can really see that they're very, very similar in that kind of rusty colored with black. Again, that's all going to blend in together, but the eared grebe has those wispy plumes that are kind of coming off what you would think of as its ears, and the horned grebe has more of those kind of solid yellow patch extending back from the eye. Eared grebes usually found in groups, horned grebes usually found in pairs. Except of course with on the very early season migration, sometimes you'll see them grouped up, but by and large, when you're seeing them, for the most part, they're just found in pairs. And just to drive the shape point home, I'll highlight that little cone head look and the more of a flat top look. 'Cause there is a little bit of a peak here, but overall the head looks fairly flat top. And if you're just looking at the silhouette at a distance, that triangular shape of the eared grebe really starts to become evident. They really look delicate, tiny, with a little cone head to them. The horned grebe, their head looks much more flat topped from a distance. So that is the eared grebe and the horned grebe. And don't worry, the rest of it gets easier from here today. Next up, we have the Wilson snipe. If you have an older field guide, you might know this bird by the common snipe. It was separated from the Eurasian species, so we have now our own Wilson's snipe, have a medium-sized shorebird. The thing that really stands out is its long, straight bill, has a relatively large head on a short neck. And for the most part, they kind of tuck that neck up into the rest of their body, so it almost looks like in a lot of cases that they don't have a neck at all. So rather chunky body, it's a big body compared to the rest of the proportions on it. Long bill, chunky body. Overall, both sexes look the same. They're mottled brown overall. If you get the chance to see them, from behind and a little bit above, they've got these pale buff stripes down their back, which is very cute. And they have little, paler stripes along their head. They have a stripe down the center of their head, but for the most part, you're going to be identifying this one by sound. So we'll get to that in a second here. This is a bird that inhabits shallow wetlands. It could be a large wetland so long as there's a shallowish area that kind of leads up into it. So shallow wetlands and damp soil habitats, because they go around and they probe with that nice long bill. They've actually got little pressure sensitive cells on the outside of their bill. So as they're probing into the muck and the dirt and what have you, they can actually feel when prey, passes over their bill, and they'll open their bill quickly and snatch it right up. So they're going after larval insects, earthworms, crustaceans, and mollusks. So again, probing that kind of wet soil, mud, shallow water habitat. And that's why, they are so tied to that habitat, because that's their feeding ground. They are designed to feed in that kind of wet, mucky substrate. But they're just so cool to watch. They almost look a little bit like they're, a sewing machine needle poking into the muck. They also have a really neat flight display. So the males will give this display, and the really cool thing about that is it's not a vocalization that they're making, with their vocal box or anything. This is a physical sound. So I've highlighted it here, and these outer tail feathers, these two on either side, as the bird flies up, gains altitude, it makes a huge steep drop and it goes really, really fast. And the wind moving over those feathers is what makes their display sound, which is super cool. And you can hear it in the flight display because it sounds like the bird is all around you, and it sounds like, it's starting from far away, it's getting louder, and then it's kind of tapering off and getting quieter and quieter. So all of that is part of its display. They'll do this in the air, and they can actually be kind of hard to count because when they're doing this display, they're up and they're flying great distances and they're going this way and that way. And so usually if I'm trying to count them, I'm trying to count the overlapping winnow calls, or if I can tell there's one on one side and one on the other, it can be really neat. So let's listen to that winnowing flight display. So how that sort of thing evolves is totally beyond me, but I think it's just super cool that it is a physical sound, much like when grouse beat their wings. This isn't a vocalization that the bird is like singing as we would typically think of a bird doing. They do have a call that they vocalize, and it almost sounds like a squeaking wheel. It's a fairly regular interval, but it's kind of a keck, 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 and they'll often do this from the ground or a low perch. I've had them do this on, fence posts or on the ground. You don't often hear this as they're flying. They usually do it as they're on the ground. So here's the kek 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 call. So just a little squeaky kind of wheel call. Kick, 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 kick. Play it once more for it 'cause it's kind of short. And it is relatively loud. That winnowing flight display, though, it's just so cool, and you hear it all around you, and I love it. It always, to me, that's my indication, especially I'm out doing like nocturnal work. It's like, oh, there's a wetland nearby because I'm hearing the Wilson snipe call, and they'll call at all kinds of different times a day. Another one with a really wide distribution, you're likely to see this pretty much anywhere you go in Canada that has trees, essentially. Okay, and last but not least, our last bird for this session is the black tern. So this is an easy introduction to terns and gulls. So terns and gulls are, for the most part, large-ish birds that are all kind of difficult to tell apart, except the black tern. The black tern is small and has this jet black head and body. Like it's just super, super black, very regular, and its wings and tail are this silvery color that just contrast so, so beautifully. Both sexes look the same, and they have really narrow wings as the terns do. Gulls tend to have a bit bigger, broader wings. Black terns, or terns in general, have kind of more slender, pointier wings and slender, pointier bills. They have a really buoyant and erratic flight. It's almost like watching butterflies. They just kind of flit around and move on the air very, very delicately. And what they do is they pick insects off the water's surface. So you'll see them in association with wetlands. They nest colonially in shallow marshes on floating vegetation. And they're one of these species that is really, really susceptible to having their nests swamped by wave action. So you can actually see this is a bird here on a nest. And I've seen some of their nests where literally they're a couple of centimeters away from falling into the water. It's just a very precarious little floating nest. So you can imagine if this is in a shallow of a bigger body of water, if someone goes by on a motorboat and kind of artificially creates stronger waves and you would get into that shallow area, it can swamp out their eggs. So this is one that's kind of sensitive to that sort of disturbance. And they do a lot of picking up off of the surface of the water. Other terns, they dive into the water, but black terns, they just kind of delicately flit and float above the wetland. And they can fly really long distances to forage for food. So they have their nesting colony, but they have been clocked going about like 80 kilometers away sometimes in search of food. And sometimes they do this in groups, and you can be standing at a wetland that has no black terns, and you're just, counting birds, enjoying the wetland, what have you, and all of a sudden you hear these harsh squawks, and suddenly there's 15 black terns all around you. And then just as soon as they arrive, sometimes all of a sudden they're all gone because they've moved on to the next foraging wetland. So they're really neat species in that regard. Much like all terns, if you're near the nesting colony, they will let you know about it. Their main mode of defense is basically screaming at you and dive bombing you to get you away from that nesting colony. So they're a really neat little species, and you'll see them foraging, like I said, a long ways from their nesting colony. They're going to pick things up like insects, small fish, snails, frogs, and tadpoles if they're small and they can get them at the water surface. Again, they don't dive into the water, they really pluck stuff off of the surface. And they have kind of harsh squawks, which to me always reminded me of something like it sounds like they swallowed a dog's squeaky toy. So it really is like, a harsh, squeaky, squawky kind of noise. They're another one with a fairly wide distribution across North America. We're going to see them in a lot of different places across Canada and the northern US. And again, another one with a larger global distribution. Okay, onto the amphibians. So spring peepers are kind of magical. They are really, really tiny, and they have an outrageously loud call for their body size. If you do get the chance to see them, they're about an inch in length, and they have an X on their back. Much like all of the other frogs we've talked about, the overall coloration can vary a fair bit from tan to brown to greens to gray, and that happens with most of the frogs. But these guys have this nice little X that goes across their back, making them easy to identify, and they're also really small. If you could see them more, they would be easier to identify just because, once you get them, it's fairly obvious what you have, but they're so hard to find because they are so small. You'll often find them in and around wooded ponds, but they like to hang out on the moist vegetation. And if you've ever, been to, say, eastern Manitoba in the spring, or, anywhere in eastern North America in the spring, you've probably heard this. And they'll often get going in this really loud chorus, and there'll be tons of them. And it's just kind of a neat peeping noise. So very, very loud. Again, if you've been anywhere in the east in the springtime, you've likely heard this. They're just phenomenally loud for their tiny size. And what was really cool during the last year of the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas, we had people hear them in Saskatchewan for the first time. So in 2021 on Wood Lake near Pelican Narrows, we had our field staff hear them in the early season. So that was super exciting. It's one of those areas, especially in, much of the northern boreal forest. We just don't have a ton of people out there who know what a spring peeper might even be listening for them. So chances are good that they've always kind of been there to some extent or another, but just having somebody out there who knows what this species sounds like to record them is part of, refining some of those range maps. So just that's a good lesson to always think of range maps as a best guess, a good suggestion. They're not written in stone. The birds aren't consulting them when they're on migration, or the frogs aren't consulting them like, oh, I'm out of range. Those maps are just kind of giving you a best guesstimate, and anything near the edges is to be taken with a fair amount of grain of salt, unless you have something major like the Rocky Mountains splitting salamander distributions. Unless it's like a really hard physical barrier, those range maps are kind of a little bit fluid. So that is the very tiny but very mighty little spring peeper. And last but not least, you might not realize this, but we do have tree frogs. So if you're in Manitoba, you're lucky enough to be encountering these tree frogs. For those of us in Saskatchewan and Alberta, we do have to go further east to hear them. They're small to medium size, and they have these enlarged toe pads, which makes them really, really good at sticking to any surface. They can climb up, a sheet of glass with these nice little toe pads. They are extremely variable in terms of body color, and they can change their color, so that makes them even tougher to identify. But they're pretty unique looking in terms of the frogs that we have here. They look like they should be somewhere in the tropics. They're almost blob-like when they're sitting there on whatever it is they're hanging out in their surface. They just have kind of a soft, squishy body, and they can, tuck themselves up and look really cute. The thing that stands out if you do get to see them in person is they have this yellow coloring on the underside of their back legs. So very cool if you do get the chance to see them. These guys are largely arboreal, meaning they're often found, on the vegetation, in trees, and again, around wooded ponds and on vegetation. Now, there's two species, which, they're technically two species because they can't interbreed, but what happened is the gray tree frog is a diploid organism, and humans are diploid. That means we have two copies of our chromosomes. The Cope's gray tree frog is tetraploid, which means it has four sets of those chromosomes. So a little bit of a genetic anomaly that kind of allowed them to branch off and be their own thing. So By looking at them, I don't know that you can tell the two apart. You can tell them apart a little bit by their calls. The gray tree frog, um, you can hear the pulses in the call. Both of them are kind of flat pitched, meaning it doesn't like rise or sink in pitch, but you can hear the pulses a bit more on the gray tree frog. Let's listen to that whirring. And the Cope's gray tree frog is a bit more buzzy. There's not quite that distinction between those notes there. So more of a continuous sound, whereas the gray, you can really hear those pulses. And the Cope's gray tree frog. And these can also be quite loud. I've had friends text me panicked hearing these noises at night, like, what is going on? And it's like, oh, those are tree frogs. So again, there's something that are, tough to lay eyes on unless they happen to climb up your screen or your window or the siding on your house, because otherwise they're going to look a heck of a lot like the plants that they're sitting on. But they do call, and they do call quite loudly, and especially at night. Um, this is our first introduction here of a spectrogram. Now, we use this when we're listening to bird calls. We can make recordings and we can then visualize what the sound looks like. So on the x-axis down here, it's going to be time. So the audio is going to move forward in time. This is the pitch. So lower pitch sounds lower on the kind of window pane here, and higher pitch sounds up here. And I just wanted to show you the comparison between something like the boreal chorus frog versus Cope's gray tree frog. This is a recording that we made in Manitoba. So boreal chorus frog, if you don't remember, it sounds like you're running your thumbnail across the teeth of a comb, and it kind of rises a little bit in pitch. Whereas the Cope's gray tree frog, you can even see it here. It is really flat. It doesn't rise in pitch. That boreal chorus frog rises a little bit in pitch, and you can see those kind of, it almost looks like, the teeth of the comb that you're imagining running your thumb over. And this, above all of that, is just cricket noises. So let's listen to this. So again, that boreal chorus frog sounds like you're running your thumb over the teeth of the comb, and the Cope's gray tree frog here is the one that sounds more buzzy, but is kind of flat and is a little bit lower in pitch than the boreal chorus frog. Play that once more for you. So pretty neat. And if you ever wonder, what people do when they set out a bunch of recording units and they're bringing those back and counting what they're hearing on them, this is what we're looking at. The colors can change depending on the program you're using, but this is the gist of it. Oh, it just wants to play and not go to the next one. There we go. Okay, let's recap. We had the blue-winged teal and the green-winged teal, the drakes. The blue-winged teal has that nice big crescent shape between the eye and the bill, black and white rump with that great big white patch on it. Green-winged teal, that lovely little spur on the side, that white spur that stands out a fair bit at a distance. Otherwise, got this dramatic green eyeshadow and a white patch or kind of buffy patch on the rear end. Both of them make kind of pipping or peeping noises. So here's the blue-winged teal, makes soft little pips. You're going to want to focus on visual ID for the species. And the green-winged teal, which does a louder peeping noise. And again, you're mostly going to be looking at visual ID for the species, but you can hear this one more regularly. I'll just contrast that right away with the spring peeper here. So a different quality to the peep, and you're not usually just hearing one of them, you're hearing kind of a chorus of peeping calls. We had our two similar looking grebes, the horned grebe and the eared grebe. Horned grebe, more of a flat top head, the eared grebe, more of a pointy top head. Horned grebe, you'll often just see them in pairs on small ponds. Eared grebes, you're likely to be seeing them in larger groups. Horned grebe, mostly silent throughout the breeding season, but does have a raspy kind of whinny braying call. Almost sounds like a redneck grebe that has been screaming at a concert all night. I'll just play the redneck grebe for comparison here. So the redneck grebe, much louder, and you are much, much, much more likely to hear this. I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've actually heard horned grebes myself. And eared grebes, you'll often have them in groups, and they make a poo-wee-chick, poo-wee-chick. And our Wilson's snipe, which has that winnowing flight display. As well as their keck, keck, keck kind of squeaky wheel call. And last but not least, for our birds, we have the black tern, which has a very harsh kind of a squawking noise. To me, it sounds like it swallowed a squeaky toy. And they're just such a gorgeous bird. How can you not love them? That jet black with those silvery wings and tails, just such a handsome little bird. And of course, our frogs, the spring peeper with the X on the back, very, very loud peeping. Compared to our green-winged teal, which has more of a peeping call, and you're not going to hear a chorus of them. And our tree frogs. The gray tree frogs, which has, both of them have a flat pitch, but the gray tree frog, you can hear the pulses of the whirring a little bit better. And the Cope's gray tree frog, which has a little bit more of a buzzy call. And if you're in an area with shrubs and trees, it's going to sound like it's coming not from the ground as opposed to a lot of other frogs that you might be hearing. So spring peeper and tree frogs, both of them do like to climb and hang out in vegetation more so than be on the ground. And that's it for this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in and for bearing with my really fun technical difficulty at the very beginning. You can reach me at llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. I want to give a huge thank you to our supporters, the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. You can find out more about Birds Canada on our website and through all of our socials. And we are a charity, so if you are inclined to do any charitable giving, donations help to support work like this and keep the whole organization going. So thank you again for tuning in. Thank you to all the photographers who have given me permission to use their photos and those who put them up on places like iNaturalist and make them available for non-commercial use. This presentation wouldn't be the same without all of these bird photos. I don't take terribly good bird photos, so a big thank you to everyone who does do that sort of stuff and make it available. So thank you very much, and I will shut off the recording.